This is the UnShaw Podcast, the podcast about atheism, religion, and everything in between.
Welcome everyone to the latest edition of the UnShaw Podcast. And for those of you who have been listening so far in this series, you'll know that my voice is not that of Robert Shaw. My name is Andrew Williams. Some of you will have heard me on Robert's very first podcast when I was his guest. And for this episode, something very different is being done. That's because Robert Shaw, your usual host, is actually going to be the person being interviewed. So, Robert, how do you feel about being on the other side of the microphone?
I'm conscious that I have to say a little bit more, but we'll see how it goes.
Well, I'm sure that your listeners are going to be really interested to hear what you have to say, because it's a very different way of doing things this time, isn't it? You're going to be giving us your thoughts on how the podcasts have been going so far. And I've just been wondering, when I've been listening to them, has there been much that's happened over the course of the last 12 weeks that's surprised you?
I would say there's certain things that I had an inkling about which have proven to be pleasantly surprising. I've always enjoyed talking about religion and having conversations about religion. I was a bit unsure to begin with whether those conversations would be interesting to other people. So I was pleasantly surprised to learn that quite a number of people actually enjoyed listening to the conversations. And there were multiple people who had no interest in religion. And I think they envisaged the podcast being quite dry and boring. And some of those have openly admitted to saying, when I heard about the podcast, I didn't think it would be my cup of tea. And some people in that situation prior to the start of the series have gone on to be loyal listeners. And so I'm both surprised and absolutely delighted by that.
Well, I'm not surprised that it's taken off in the way it has. And one of the things that really does strike me when I listen to them is that you seem to approach the interviews in a way where you're really very keen to learn from your guests. So you're not really interviewing them trying to prove a particular point. You're trying to prove that what they're saying is good or bad, or that it's in keeping with your views or not. But certainly the impression you give the listeners is that you're listening to each guest and actually thinking, what can I learn from this? And do you think you have learned a lot from these podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone's experience and life story you can learn something from, I guess. And despite some plaudits that I've got for the podcast, essentially I'm just sort of nudging the conversation along. To be honest, and I think the real interest lies in the life stories of some of the people I've had on.
Now, before you started doing these podcasts, some people have come across you from the work you did that was published on the Infidels website.
Yeah, when
you wrote a few pieces that offered a historical perspective on some of the Bible narratives in particular. So I'm wondering, with that in mind, how you felt when you had the chance to speak to Professor McGrath, who, of course, was a biblical scholar that you had on a couple of months ago. Did you find that that was a topic that particularly appealed to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main purpose of most of those articles that I wrote for infidels.org was trying to learn and research actually, what actually happened in the stories of, for example, Jesus' crucifixion, the resurrection, the Exodus, the Empire of King David, for example. In those articles, not only was I perhaps informing other people, but whilst I was doing them, I also informed myself about, I guess, what really happened. So that's always been something that I've been interested in. What is the truth behind the Bible? And it was interesting to learn that, I brand myself as an atheist, and Professor McGrath calls himself a Christian. It was interesting just how much we agreed on. And a recent interview I did with a chap called Peter Clark, he suggested something like, the liberal Christians, rather like Professor McGrath, who concede that, all of the stuff about Jesus' miracles and Noah's Ark and this, that, and the other, he concedes that they're not historical facts. And he was saying that atheists probably have more in common with those liberal Christians. And it's in fact the fundamentalists that both of those groups need to see as a group to challenge.
Right. Well, I can certainly see where you're coming from on that. But of course, there is the alternative perspective, isn't there, which is that with the fundamentalists, with the fundamentalist Christians or those who are adhering to the literal truth of the scriptures behind their own religion, you know where you are with them. And so for instance, a fundamentalist Christian might come along and say, well, science might suggest that some of what I believe or some of what's in the Bible might not be true. But in that case, science is probably wrong, because I believe in a God of miracles and I believe in the inerrant word of the Bible. And as soon as you start letting science or reason or history take holes out of the Bible, what are you left with? Do you think there's any merit in that type of approach that some fundamentalist Christians would take?
Do I think that there's any merit in...
Yeah, because ultimately what they are doing is being honest to their beliefs and sticking to a text that they say comes from God. Whereas if you take the very liberal approach to religion, you could have you could have to listen to, say, a Church of England minister, maybe especially the bishops, actually, and think, well, what on earth do you believe? What on earth is the point of Anglicanism if you can find yourself going so liberal and disregarding so much of the Bible? You can end up thinking, well, what on earth is the point of it?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, if you were to be skeptical about some of the beliefs of Christianity, like the resurrection and the virgin birth, and you don't believe that any of the miracles happened or Exodus or whatever, what are you left with? I guess an appreciation for culture and the heritage of a particular religion. Yeah, I mean, I suspect there are a number of people within Anglicanism and even in the sort of higher realms of the clergy who are resigned to the fact that, evolution is true and there possibly wasn't a God or whatever.
Now, I know that recently you've been going to some Quaker meetings, haven't you?
Yeah.
And I understand that's something that you've tried or something that's new in your life. How has you found that experience?
Well, one of the reasons why the podcast came about is because I had some free time on my hands, and the Quaker Meeting House in Liverpool is right in the centre of Liverpool, and they've got a number of services that take place during the week, for example. And just out of curiosity, I went to a meeting a couple of months ago, and I went to a room and there was a circle of people, and we all sat in silence for 30 minutes. And that was that. And basically, I've kept going back, really. And I think that there is definitely a benefit in spending some time shutting up and just sitting there and thinking. And basically, the Quaker meeting service ritualizes that, and you've got other people there or whatever. Now, there are people who go to these meetings who think that, God will speak to them or whatever, and God will reveal this, that, and the other. There are other Quakers who think that, this 30 minutes of silent time is time to think, to reflect, to think about how to be a better person, to think about the people that you've wronged over the course of that particular week. And I think the sort of theological beliefs of Quakers will very much vary. But I remember an early meeting I went to, one of the senior people in the Quakers started speaking to me, and I said something like, there's something quite nice about Quakerism, but I'm not sure whether there is a God. And she said something like, oh, don't worry about that. There's quite a few of us who are quite unsure about God. In addition to this practice of just sitting in silence and thinking, there was also two other aspects of Quakerism that quite appealed to me, of living a simple life, of equality, of respect for your fellow human being, respect for animals, respect for the environment, but also the fact that it's very much about action in Quakerism. There are many strands of Christianity, as you know, where it's more about what you believe. It's what makes you a good person or not. Quakerism is very much about action. Quakers are very much involved in the environment, climate change, and so on. Whereas some religious organisations are sort of bogged down with discussions about dogma and this, that, and the other. It's what you do. There's no set beliefs about the afterlife in Quakerism. It's about trying to make this world better. There'll be some of them who believe in heaven and hell and so on. But there's a lot of Quakers who believe, this is our only life. Let's not think about what our life is going to be like after we die. Try to make the world a better place for everybody in the here and now. So it's those three sort of aspects, really. The respect for silent time, which I think in the modern era is something that we've forgotten how to do, and the values of equality and respect for fellow human beings and compassion, but also getting involved in stuff that matters. Will I be a Quaker by the second series? Am I a Quaker now? I'm not. I'm more of an attendee at their meetings, I guess. Will it be something I still have an interest in 6 months' time? I don't know.
Well, I'm going to pick you up on something you said just before you finished your answer then. But before I do so, I should just say I found what you were saying then fascinating, because until you said all of that, I would have just assumed that if someone is a Quaker, then they will have certain metaphysical beliefs. So, in other words, that they will believe that there's a God of some sort. Whereas it does sound from what you're saying that although we think of Quakers as being religious, it's really religion in terms of acting in a religious way and acting in a moral way, rather than necessarily because they have any belief whatsoever in the supernatural. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is such a thing as Quaker atheism or Quaker humanism. That is a thing. And I went to a Bible study, and I thought, oh, right, okay, Bible study. All of the people at this meeting said that they didn't believe that the Bible was the Word of God.
This was a Quaker Bible study, was it?
Yeah, absolutely. We were invited to give a soundbite about what we thought of the Bible. And I said something like, oh, yeah, well, there's clearly lots of fabrication, there's lots of legend, there's lots of myth, and there's stuff that has been made up. But there are some nice moral lessons in there, and there are nice moral lessons in the works of Shakespeare. There's a moral lesson in the story of the boy who cried wolf. And we should use the Bible if we think it's good for informing our morals and our ethics, but we can also use other sources as well. If there is an omnipotent, omniscient, etc. type of God, the fact that he would reveal his plan, his ethics, how he wants us to behave, the notion that he would do that 2,000 plus years ago and then leave it at that is a bit preposterous.
Yeah.
Why isn't this God continuing to reveal to people what they're doing wrong and how to live their lives? In the Quaker meetings, there will be some people who are of the opinion that I'm here because I do believe in God, and if there is a God, I believe that his revelation is going to be ongoing, not just confined to a book that was written thousands and thousands of years ago. So there will be some people who go to these meetings thinking that God might communicate to them, and that's fine. Some of us will go there because we find the 30 minutes of silence actually quite useful. And that seems to be perfectly acceptable within the Quaker tradition, to use the worship to do that sort of thing. Then fine, that's how I choose to spend that time.
Now, you mentioned the benefits of 30 minutes of silence, but your previous answer hinted at the fact that there's going to be more than 30 minutes of silence coming up. You referred to a second series of your podcast, which also suggests that there's going to be a bit of silence in the meantime. So would you like to explain what your plans are?
Yeah, the plan is to have a little break. I've got some specials planned for over the course of the summer. And the idea is to start series 2 a little bit later this year. I basically want to keep up the standard of the conversations and give the people who are regular listeners a good experience and get back into it later on this year.
Right. Well, I'm both excited and disappointed in a rather strange, conflicting way there. Now, before I ask you a bit more about the podcast you've already had, I should ask you whether you have heard about the sad news that broke earlier today about Daniel Dennett. And if you didn't know, you probably know where I'm leading. I suspect a lot of people who listen to your podcast will have come across him as one of the leading atheists, especially in the new atheist movement. He was one of the so-called four Horsemen of the Apocalypse back, 20-odd years or so ago now that we went through that new atheist phase. Did you have the chance to come across much of his work?
He's somebody I knew of as opposed to knowing his work intimately. So I'm more familiar with the work of Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, etc. There's one quote which often comes up on Twitter that Daniel Dennett said, and it's something like, there's no easy way to tell someone that they have devoted their lives to a folly.
I recall seeing him being interviewed, and I think he was talking about an article he had written that he had called it something like "Thank Goodness." And essentially, he'd been very ill about 20 years ago, and he recovered. And he was saying that when people had said to him something along the lines of, well, I prayed for you and thank God you're now better, he would say, well, instead of thanking God, thank goodness. And I don't mean thank goodness as some kind of metaphor, but rather the goodness of the doctors, the goodness of the nurses, the goodness of the scientists who investigated a way of creating a medicine. And I thought, actually, yeah, that's quite a good way of looking at things. So many good things that religious people will often automatically attribute to God, whereas actually the real cause of this is just the hard work and often, no doubt, good fortune of many, many people. Did you feel that your own atheist inclinations were bolstered by the last 12 weeks or so of podcasts? Or did you actually find maybe the more you learn, did it make you almost more unsure, to quote back at you the name of your podcast? Because some people find the more they learn about something, the more uncertain they become of the answer.
I mean, I didn't encounter any opinion or any information from any of my guests which caused me to think how I thought at the start of the podcast series needed to be reevaluated. And, I think you're right in that the beliefs, the metaphysical beliefs that I had prior to starting the podcast have probably not really changed at all, I would say. When I speak to people of faith and I raise the issue of questionable evidence, they tend to say things like, oh, well, you've got to, embrace faith first. It's almost like they're saying you've got to believe in this stuff first. And when you believe in it, then it will all make sense. And that's rather like a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Now, I remember when I was about 11 or 12, I went through a phase of believing that UFOs were quite regular visitors to Earth, for example, or, we could see UFOs all around us and everything. And as a result, I saw things through that lens. And I remember walking home from school one day and, seeing something in the sky and thinking, oh, wow, a UFO. And it was probably, a flight from Ibiza back to Liverpool or something like that. Many of these believers are saying, oh, you just have to get rid of your skepticism and just embrace it. My view on that is that you just end up believing in it and it becomes some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Those early Christians like Aquinas tried to come up with these arguments for God's existence that were based on reason. And ultimately, they're so full of holes that I think they've pretty much been debunked, really, haven't they? The kind of first cause argument, and to William Paley, who I believe was only 200 years ago, looking at design in the world. The whole design argument is full of holes. So I don't think it can be done coming to a religion by reason. The only way you're going to do it by faith. But, what causes you to have that faith? A religious experience or whatever?
You'll recall that among the articles I wrote for the New Statesman was one in which I asked quite a few quite prominent people who were Christians, why do you believe in God? And the piece I wrote for the New Statesman essentially just gave various answers, and then I wrote another piece commenting on it. And what was apparent was that they gave a big range of reasons. When I did something similar with a whole load of atheists, and they basically nearly all said the same thing, i.e. the lack of evidence. But what did strike me when the Christians were giving their range of reasons was that while the reasons, well, in some cases, quite good reasons, I found it unlikely that probably any of the reasons really did explain how that person came to believe in God. In other words, I just don't think that most believers will think, I think that, I don't know, we can't explain where the laws of science come from. Therefore, God must have created the laws of science. Therefore, I'll become a Christian. I think probably what really happens is someone just has a bit of a yearning for there to be a God. They might be in a difficult stage in their life, or maybe they're following what the parents believe. So they come to believe in God. And then when someone says to them, why do you believe in God? How can there possibly be a God? They will then say, well, you needed a God to create life or to create the universe or to explain where the laws of science come from. Whereas I think with atheism, it probably is more straightforward, isn't it? It's people saying, I just don't think there's the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people I spoke to who either were people of faith or people who used to be people of faith, it was upbringing, it was some sort of religious experience that they framed as an encounter with God or Jesus or whatever. I don't think I've met many people who have claimed that reasoning and logic has brought them to God. But you might be quite right in that, that's often the arguments that they'll use, because, how do you convince someone that you saw Jesus and had him speak to you? How do you relate that without coming across a little bit weird to most people?
We did have the curious incident with Ayaan Hirsi Ali recently, didn't we? And of course, you know what I'm referring to there. She was a very prominent atheist. And then a few months ago, she announced her conversion to Christianity. But I don't know if you recall, Robert, the reasons she gave were really quite surprising reasons. And she was saying that she felt there were real dangers in the world from is either Islam or Islamism, which clearly is an important distinction, but I can't recall which it was for her, plus China and Russia, plus wokeism. And she saw Christianity as being a way to guard against that. Now, I certainly am not the first person to say that they are unusual reasons to become a Christian, especially if you really are a Christian who's believing the metaphysical claims. But do you think that's maybe not as unusual a scenario as it sounds? In other words, do you think maybe there are lots of people who are relying on reasons that one would think would have absolutely nothing to do with metaphysical matters? Maybe one just looks at religious people and says, oh, I like the look of them, I want to be one of them. Well, reasons that would sound unsatisfactory ones for converting to Christianity, but maybe many people were doing it anyway.
Well, I remember seeing an interview with Dawkins about her, and you're right, his analysis was that for her, Christianity was a vehicle to use to protest against Islamification or whatever, and wokeism, and perhaps declining moral standards. And if she wants to use Christianity to do that, then fine. I've never heard her utter anything which is blatantly theistic. I've not heard her talk about the divinity of Jesus. But instead, she's using it because she, I guess, feels threatened by Islamification and secularism being a bit sort of materialistic and everything, and protesting against, like I said, moral standards. And does that describe a large amount of Christians' reasoning for becoming a Christian? Then probably not. And of course, there are other means you can disagree with wokeism and declining moral standards, but, perhaps she sees it as kind of strength in numbers kind of thing. So,
yeah. And of course, a rallying cry against wokeism might, to some ears, sound as though it's a rallying cry against leftist politics, because obviously wokeism generally is just it's associated more with those on the political left than on the right. What's your take on the political leanings of Christians as opposed to atheists? Certainly from what I can see, in Britain at any rate, and probably in America, but probably more so in America, Christianity does seem to be more associated with those on the right politically. Whereas I think you could make a decent argument for saying that Jesus' teachings don't necessarily sit comfortably with right-wing politics. Or do you think I'm missing something there?
I wrote a piece for the Infidels website in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, where essentially I was making the point that you can be of any political persuasion and look to Christianity for your influences. You can be this right-wing, capital punishment, string them up, and you can be this more touchy-feely, Jesus was somebody who mixed with outsiders and healed the sick and so on. And I remember one quote from one of the epistles, and it was one that said something like, you might recognize the quote, but it was something like, someone who doesn't work should not eat. Now, that quote was used recently by a Republican congressman or senator, whatever he was, to justify reducing Social Security. If you don't work, then you don't deserve to have wealth and food and this, that, and the other. So I've got this very right-wing Republican. That quote was actually also used by Lenin in one of his books as well. Those who don't work should not eat. And what he's saying there, is all of these people who have passive income, all of these people who are living off inherited wealth, they don't deserve to eat because they're not working to get their money. These aristocrats should be in the fields working just like the rest of us for the collective benefits. So I think the Bible is not a very good tool for working out your politics. This is a recurring theme. I can remember the quote, but not who said it. And it was something like, people don't look to the Bible to find out what to agree with or disagree with or how to live their lives or whatever. They've already decided that, and then they go to the Bible to support that opinion. And that's very much a stark example, really. We've got the same Bible verse. A very right-wing Republican goes to it and uses it as justification for reducing Social Security. It's also used by Lenin. Yeah, I mean, if you were to do a straw poll, I think in the UK it's going to be quite traditional Church of England, middle-class types, isn't it? And I think, in America, it's largely the fundies and the evangelicals and so on. But I don't think they get in their politics from the Bible, really. They get their politics and their viewpoints on things externally to the Bible.
I'll finish, if I may, by if you could interview any two people in the next series of the UnShaw podcast, one religious person and one atheist. So any two people on the planet, who would you interview? Who would be appearing in the next episode of the UnShaw podcast?
I think it would be good to interview Dawkins for obvious reasons. I think also it would be interesting to interview a very sort of fundamentalist Christian, perhaps one of the ones in the US. I think is what I would like to do, but I can only envisage that turning quite antagonistic in a way, because of all of my guests, I'm asking these quite, provocative and challenging questions, and it seems that those types don't really have an answer, and as a result tend to resort to kind of ad hominem attacks.
People do see fundamentalist Christians as having extreme views. That might be unfair, but I think it is how most people think of it. If you interview someone with views like that, because they're so far distant from your own, I suppose there is the danger, isn't there, that the two of you might not necessarily be able to do much more other than just swap opinions, if you like. Whereas I think that your podcasts and the series have achieved more than that, where certainly I get the impression that when you've been asking your guests a question, frequently those guests might have had a similar view to you. But either way, between the two of you, you've managed to make progress towards, well, certainly you getting to really understand where they're coming from. And yet perhaps that would be difficult if you were talking to somebody who had an extreme view that was very different to yours. And maybe especially if you're talking to somebody who is trying to use your podcast as a platform to try to convert people, because I suppose you're not necessarily wanting your listeners just to be preached at. Do you think that to any extent you can have the same issue with interviewing a prominent atheist, maybe a Dawkins type figure?
Yeah. And I'm going to go back to my interview with Paul Clark, for example. Whereas some Christian fundamentalists, the evangelicals and so on, are quite insufferable, I do find certain elements within the online atheist community a little bit insufferable as well. Often they're attacking a straw man. They're attacking the belief in the Exodus. They're attacking the belief that Jesus literally walked on water. But there's many people who would call themselves Christians who don't agree that those things align with reality. You get the same emotion from fundamentalists than you see in a high-brand atheist, I think. And certainly some of the content creators I've encountered from the US tend to be very scathing, I think.
Is there anything you'd like to say to your listeners before you finally switch off your microphone for the last time for a few months?
Just a thank you, really. There's quite a number of people online, particularly on Twitter, who are big supporters of the podcast, and I'd like to say thank you to them. But more broadly, just everyone, really. You know, when I look at the places that have listened to the podcast, all sorts of these weird and wonderful places crop up. You know, the Dominican Republic. I even had a listener from Saudi Arabia for one of the episodes. It's surprising that I'm not banned there or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, thank you to everyone who listened to the podcast worldwide, and also the website is getting 1,000 hits a month as well, which I'm very grateful for, and I didn't envisage it happening to the extent that it has. Thank you to everyone who's listened, and thank you to everyone who's visited the website.
Well, thanks very much. I'm looking forward to the next episode, whenever it is. It's been great talking to you today.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the UnShaw Podcast throughout this series on religion and atheism. It's been an incredible journey diving deep into these complex and often controversial topics, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to our conversations as much as I've enjoyed having them. I'm excited to share that plans are already underway for Series 2, and trust me, it's going to be even more compelling. With 2 interviews already recorded, you'll be able to hear a rare media interview with former pop mogul, TV celebrity and current sex offender Jonathan King. Here's a quick excerpt.
Well, it really started in 2000 when I was arrested in November, I think, of that year, and accused of having had sex with various young men who were under the age of 16. This was not true.
You'll also hear my conversation with a prominent young earth creationist.
There are no scientific errors in the Bible. There can't be any scientific errors because science is truth that's come from God. What's wrong is that evolution is not a science. Evolution is a worldview that you have to adopt to try and avoid the issue of the fact there is actually a God who will judge you when you die.
As we wrap up this 12th episode, I can't help but notice that many good things come in multiples of 6. From Jesus' disciples to the number of episodes in each series of Faulty Towers. Let's not forget 6-packs, 6-string guitars, and the band Destiny's Child. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to all my listeners for your support, engagement and thought-provoking feedback throughout this series. Your contributions have enriched our conversations and made this podcast what it is. As we part ways for now, I'll leave you with this thought. In a world where beliefs often divide us, let's strive to find common ground and mutual respect in our quest for understanding. Until Series 2, take care and keep questioning. Goodbye for now.